Croc Legend of the Gobbos is one of those weird 3D platformers because back in the 90s when 3D became a thing, every single developer was experimenting with different forms of level design or character control, and it gave us a really interesting period in gaming where you had the Mario 64 sort of open, freeform platforming, then you had the more linear, fidelity focused, precision focused Crash Bandicoot, and then you got the more open, adventurous style of Spyro, which is my favourite. And just like with any genre, all the stuff started to trickle down, and then you started to get the lesser platformers. You got the Tonic Trouble on the N64, or Glover, which I played last year for the first time, which is such a weird game. And you also got Croc Legend of the Gobbos, which is a very strange platformer for multiple reasons. Now, the actual story of its development is quite strange because there's loads of different accounts and nobody knows who's actually telling the truth. But the basic gist of it is that Argonaut Games were brought in-house to Nintendo to work on Star Fox because they invented some magical 3D stuff on the Game Boy or something like that. And while this was going on, they were helping out Nintendo. They also pitched a prototype for a 3D Yoshi racing game, which eventually would become Croc, and you can actually see that Croc's model and Yoshi's model are very similar. But apparently, Nintendo shut that down, and some ex-Argonaut developers claim that Croc is actually one of the main inspirations for Mario 64, and it's the reason why Nintendo got the idea to do a 3D platformer. Now, we don't know how true that is, but Croc Legend of the Gobbos might be one of the most influential games of all time, but we don't really know. But what this game does, which is very strange, is that it was released in 1997, a year after Mario 64 and Crash Bandicoot 1, and it's a 3D platformer that has tank controls. And when I heard that this game has tank controls, I was like, oh no, I'm not going to enjoy this. So I loaded it up, I watched the cute intro cutscene, and then I was slapped in the face by this absolutely amazing music. And listen to this, and let me know if you hear any similarities to a modern 3D platformer theme song down below in the comments. Yes, it does sound similar to a mustachioed plumber game, and unfortunately it doesn't share any other similarities with Mario, because this is just a bit of a strange 3D platformer that hasn't aged very well, and it's not overly bad. I'm not going to sit here and say the game is absolutely terrible. It's not overly frustrating where I wanted to throw my controller out the window, but every single time I sat down to start up another session, I was just like, I don't really want to play this game. Now, luckily, Croc is getting a remake soon, which I believe is warranted. And if you're into this kind of retro content where we play the originals before the remakes to see if the game holds up or what things can be improved in the future, then please subscribe. I'm trying to get to 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year. And also, join the members if you really want it. Now, on with the video. Now, we have to start by talking about the tank controls because they're actually quite strange. I loaded into the first level and I was expecting to not enjoy this game whatsoever. I thought Croc would control like absolute crap, but he actually doesn't. You have full 3D analog movement, and yes, it is tank controls. Like if you hold back on the analog stick, he will shimmy back. You can press L or R1 to shimmy left and right, and also when you jump and press L and R1, he spins in the air. You also have an ability where you can do a 180 turn, which is very handy. And when you're walking around, he actually feels pretty okay to control, especially in the beginning levels where the stakes aren't very high, you have wide platforms, and you know, falling into pits doesn't really happen that often. There's not that many pits that you can actually fall into. And I was going through the first couple of levels and I was honestly admiring the kind of approach to level design because it is certainly different. So in each level you have the normal gems you can collect, which are basically sonic rings. If you take damage, you fall on the ground, you can pick them up. If you have 0 and get hit, you die. Also, there are colourful gems that you have to find which open a special door at the end of the level. And then there's also Gobbos that you have to collect, which are the cute little furry guys that you're rescuing. But how the levels actually work is quite interesting because some of them have a bit of backtracking where you'll be in one room and there'll be a Gobbos in a cage that has a key on it, but there's no key in that room. So you could have to go through 2 more rooms to find the key and then backtrack to collect him. Now, it doesn't happen too often where you're doing loads of backtracking. It might only be room to room instead of multiple rooms. But I like that it actually just feels different. There was no real backtracking in Crash 1. There were a couple of levels where if you wanted to get all the boxes, you sort of had to walk back on yourself, but it didn't happen very often. And then with the likes of Spyro and Crash, the levels were so open that even though you might actually be returning to a certain spot, it doesn't feel like backtracking the way it does here. Because I would say that Croc is a middle ground between the likes of Crash and Spyro. Now, the levels are nowhere near as large as Spyro, and there is loading screens in between the different sections of the levels, but it does have a bit more open level design. But then it becomes a bit more Crash-like, especially later on in the levels where things start to become a bit more precise than the likes of Spyro, where you will have to jump on 6 crumbling platforms in a row and get it all right and make sure your momentum is correct and all that sort of stuff. Or you will have some very small platforms that you have to jump on, and some of the platforms in the later levels are genuinely like almost just the size of Croc's hitbox. You don't really have much room for error there. And as the levels go on, they just become slightly more frustrating because you will jump to a ledge and you'll just have slightly less momentum than you probably thought you had, and then you'd either grab onto the ledge, or in some instances it would feel like you should grab onto the ledge but you wouldn't actually, you just almost slip off. And then sometimes you will grab the ledge, but it's one of the crumbling platforms, so you have to get up really quick. And basically, if I get this right, and it could be my controller, I'm unsure, if you latch onto a ledge to grab it, you have to release every single button and then press forward on the analog stick. So it's kind of a bit clunky, and I think in general this game just kind of feels clunkier than the other 3D platformers of the time. It's definitely the tier below the likes of Mario, Crash and Spyro. Again, it's not overly bad, but there wasn't really much driving me forward because there was a couple of levels that just really annoyed me. Specifically the climbing sections where you would do the overhead climbing like in Crash or something like that. And that's fine, it just feels clunky, it's kind of slow. But there was a couple of times where there was enemies spinning around, and no joke, you have to be at the exact right point as the enemy passes you, and then you have to just book it, and you move so slow that you really have to get it like almost inch perfect. And the thing is that in Croc, the hitboxes on your attack, on you and the enemies, downright awful. The amount of times where I would feel like I should hit an enemy and they didn't die, the amount of times where I feel like an enemy is nowhere near me and I get hit, was just insane. And that's probably the most frustrating part of it, because eventually, when you get into the bosses, it highlights just how bad every single hitbox is, because the fine line between hitting the boss and getting hit is very minimal. And there is a couple of times where you will hit the boss and you won't be able to make it out quick enough for them to not hit you, so then you just take damage. And it's just kind of annoying. Again, it's almost just like death by 1,000 cuts, because the jumping feels fine, the movement feels fine. But then when you start to add in just the general janky feeling of everything, like the collision on certain platforms, the sort of timing that you have to bring in, and especially when you are doing platforming sections that are spinning. So as they're spinning, you also have to spin, but there's no really sort of surefire way of spinning without having like a turning radius, which sometimes you will fall off the platform. You can jump mid-air and then press L1 or R1 to reorientate yourself. But again, it's all just clunky. Now, luckily in the remake, they are adding non-tank controls, and I do actually feel like this game with normal controls might actually be quite fun. Obviously, it'd be quite primitive. Like if you go back and even play Crash 1 or Spyro 1, they're very primitive in comparison to their later games, which obviously makes sense. And Croc is an extremely primitive platformer. He doesn't have any fancy mechanics, and the levels themselves just feel like levels. Obviously, if you go back to Crash 1 or Spyro 1, yes, they are more primitive, but the levels feel cohesive and they feel like they are a part of a place. Whereas here, it's like they dropped a level into a game, and you can sense that, and that's why it feels a bit more primitive. But I do think if they update the controls, this game could actually be quite decent. Now, it's not all bad, and I know I started off on the negative side because this game is more negative than positive. But one thing that Croc has in spades is charm. Croc is really charming. The Gobbos are really cute. The intro animation is, again, really cute. It's about Croc basically being taken in by the Gobbos, and you get to see how the Gobbos were treating him and teaching him how to walk and all this sort of stuff. It's very cute. But one thing that they get really right is the music, as I touched on at the start. The music in this game is fantastic. That opening theme is brilliant. But another thing that they get right is all the little jingles, like when you pick up the gems, or Croc's little kapow when he drops, or the little noise the Gobbos make when you pick them up. There's all those little details that they got right, and it is quite charming, if a bit clunky. Now, Argonaut is remaking this game, and it just needs a couple of quality of life improvements to make it less frustrating and overall just make it way more playable. But I do like this era of 3D platformers. Obviously, I grew up playing these games. Now, I was born in 1998, so I came to them a bit later. But the likes of Crash and Spyro and eventually the PS2 games and all that, I did play a lot of Mario 64 as well. And one thing that I love about this era, as I touched on at the start of the video, is that every different developer was trying different things, trying out different level layouts, different control schemes, and I like that the majority of them are actually playable on modern hardware now. You have, or you will have Croc, you have Mario 64 on the Switch, you have Crash in the Insane Trilogy, you have Spyro in the Reignited Trilogy. I don't think Rayman 2 is available. Nights into Dreams, I'm not sure. Sonic Adventure is on PC, so you have the majority of these games playable on modern hardware so that you can see what they were going for. Maybe they tried this and it didn't work out, or this part was good, or this part was bad, or, you know, it's just a great little case study. But I think going forward, there's a couple of things. Obviously, they are removing the tank controls, which is going to be a massive thing. The tank controls themselves actually aren't too bad, but normal controls will make this game better. It might make it extremely easy, but I'm not opposed to that. I don't mind platformers being easy. I think they need to remove the lives, because again, that will remove a lot of the frustration of... There was a couple of sections in these levels that were so annoying that the rest of the level was so easy, I'd get to no problem. And then, just like the climbing section I mentioned earlier, I believe in level 4-1, I will have footage here, that section basically made me lose all my lives. And then I had to start the rest of the level again and do that. So removal of lives, or even removal, or give us the option to remove lives, or the options to have lives if you want it. That's obviously the best thing. And the final thing is that at the end of every single boss fight, it feels like the game is broken. There's no transition. The level just ends. You get the final hit on the boss, and then level complete pops up, and it feels like your controller disconnected. That's the only way I can describe it. So in general, the game just needs a bit of, you know, TLC and polish up some of that janky bits. So yeah, Croc is just the definition of a middle of the road early 3D platformer. Not overly bad, not overly good. It's just frustrating. It's not exactly unfun to play, but it's not exactly fun. It's literally right down the middle. And I think it deserves a remake because of the importance, or maybe the sort of significance it has to the PlayStation 1, because it's actually one of the best-selling games. I think it's in like the top 25 best-selling games on the PlayStation 1, which is insane. So thank you everybody for watching. I have loads of more videos on 3D platformers over here, so check them out. There's been a lot of remakes this year. Please subscribe. As I said, I'm trying to get to 1,000 subscribers. Join the members down below if you really want to support the channel. And I'll see you all on the next video. Goodbye.